The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 24th chapter. Now on that same day, when Jesus had appeared to Mary Magdalene, 2 disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them, and the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my spirit be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. After Jesus' resurrection, 2 of Jesus' followers are walking on the road to a place called Emmaus. Emmaus is 7 miles away from Jerusalem, so this is a significant journey on foot. We do not know why Cleopas and the unnamed disciple, who is most likely Cleopas' wife, decided to undertake this trek. Perhaps they thought they would be safer in another city. Perhaps they just needed to get away from the place where they had witnessed so much trauma during the past week. They do not know or are unable yet to believe that Jesus has risen from the dead. And when Jesus begins to walk with them, they do not recognize him. But as they are walking, they talk to the stranger about everything that has happened. "But we had hoped," they say, "that he was the one to redeem Israel. We had hoped." There are so many things in our lives right now about which we can say that very thing. We had hoped. We had hoped that baseball season would soon begin. We had hoped that the trip we had planned would not be canceled. We had hoped to be back together in church by now. We had hoped to finish the school year. We had hoped to play a spring sport. We had hoped to visit our friends. We had hoped to keep our job. We had hoped that we or our loved ones would not become ill. The spring especially is a time of our lives that is usually full of hope. We have hopes about the end of school years, about graduations, about Easter celebrations, about the ending of winter and the beginning of summer. We have hopes and plans for vacations and trips and festivals and all sorts of summer events. And over a month ago now, in just a few short days, all of those hopes and plans were canceled, postponed, changed, or filled with uncertainty. We still celebrated Easter, but it was different. The end of the school year is, of course, still happening, but now everything is online. Everything is different than we expected, and everything is different than what we had hoped for. The grief of the disciples about Jesus' death was real, not just because he was a person whom they loved, but because they had hopes and plans for him and for their own futures that they felt could now no longer come to pass. As we grieve our own very real loss of normalcy, we can identify with those two disciples more than ever before. This spring has been so different than all of our hopes. Just like the disciples, when we hope for things, the hopes turn into plans. And just like the disciples, we are full of grief when those plans cannot come to pass in the way that we envisioned. We form ideas about what will be in our own futures. We all had a vision for this spring that looks nothing like what we are experiencing now. It is important to note that the disciples' grief was not wrong. Jesus could have said, "Why, it's me, the person you were hoping for. I am alive, so you better snap out of it." But Jesus did not make himself known to them then. He allowed them to grieve. He walked with them and they talked together about their grief, about what exactly the disciples had hoped for, and why it no longer looked like it was possible. A crisis like what we have been experiencing is full of grief, and this story teaches us that all of it is real and valid. Each of our hopes that has not come to pass, Jesus wants to hear about it. The risen Christ gives us space for all of our laments, no matter how simple or silly they seem. He does not try to minimize our pain or magically wave it away. He simply walks with us and hears our pain and helps share our burdens, just like he did with the disciples on the road. We also must keep in mind that the disciples had a very specific vision, a plan, a hope about how exactly Jesus was going to redeem Israel, and none of it involved Jesus getting himself crucified. It involved a very much alive and powerful Jesus overthrowing the religious and political leaders and saving them from oppression at the hands of the Romans, not being killed like a common criminal. Even if the stories that the disciples had heard about Jesus raising from the dead were true, none of this fits the plan. In the midst of their grief, they would not have been able to see how a resurrected Jesus fit into their hopes and plans anyways. And so while they walk together, this stranger reminds the disciples of something important. Their plans are not the only plans. Their hopes are not the only hopes. The scope that they had in mind for Jesus' redemption of Israel, of the world as they knew it, was really quite small. Jesus, as a stranger, walks with them and talks with them about the scriptures they would have known to remind them that the way they had in mind to redeem Israel is not the only way that it is possible. Jesus expands their vision. Even in their best moments, no matter how many hints Jesus gave them, the most loyal of Jesus' followers would never have realized on their own that Jesus actually intended to redeem the entire world through his death and rising again. That was too big, too overwhelming, and too crazy to possibly be true. Their hopes were not big enough, and so they felt that their hope ended with Jesus' death. When this stranger on the road reminds them that God's vision might not be the same as their vision, that there is not only one way to bring about the redemption of the world, it must give them some comfort, because they invite the man to stay with them. And when he breaks bread with them, an action that they surely witnessed Jesus perform many times in their life together, they see him for who he is. And because they have expanded the scope of their hoping, they know now what it means for Jesus to be risen. It is not just that they have seen a person they love who they thought was dead and now is alive. It's that they know what that means in the terms of their own futures and the future of the entire world. That is what makes them run 7 miles back to Jerusalem to tell the good news. Jesus is alive. And they can set aside their old hopes for a totally new vision that is much more incredible than anything they had pictured before. No one, not even God, hopes for a pandemic that disrupts the lives of millions of people. I have heard interpretations that the pandemic is trying to teach us something, as if God did this to teach us a lesson. I do not believe that that is true. That is not in line with our belief in a loving God. But this story reminds us that our hopes, our visions, and our plans for the future are not the only ones. That the way we think things must be is not the only way. Our human narrow-mindedness sometimes limits how we think God can act in the world. We find it easy to see God at work in our lives when everything is going exactly as we had hoped. But we struggle to see God at work when life gets in the way of our plans. Our human narrow-mindedness doesn't have room for God to bring life out of death or life out of a pandemic. And our human narrow-mindedness keeps us from recognizing the risen Christ in our midst. Things aren't going as we feel they should, so it does not seem possible that the risen Christ is still here. But this story reminds us that that is exactly where he is, right in the midst of this journey with us through a pandemic. The risen Christ walks alongside us and gently calls us to expand our hopes. He calls us to recognize him in the faces of those who are working to help. The faces of healthcare workers, of governors and leaders, of all essential workers, of teachers recreating curriculum, those officials trying to deal with the overwhelming numbers of unemployed persons. He calls us to recognize him in the small gestures of love we are all able to show each other during these difficult days. And he calls us to recognize him in the world around us as creation takes advantage of diminished human activity and begins new growth. Our grief is real. The things we hoped for are real. Jesus will never minimize our pain, and he sympathizes with us in our grief and shares it. But Jesus also gently calls us to a new vision and a new hope. He gently reminds us that no matter what is going on around us and no matter what griefs we face each day, he is risen and still at work in our midst, and he reveals himself to us in surprising and amazing ways. We often interpret the breaking of bread in this story as communion. That is not wrong, but it can also be interpreted as hospitality, as love toward neighbor. whenever we show and receive love this week, no matter what that looks like. May Christ be so revealed to us, and in those moments, may we place our hope. Amen.